I escaped my abusive marriage during a rainstorm with nothing but a small bag and bruises hidden beneath my coat. For 3 years, I endured his fists and cruel words, becoming a shell of the Yorkshire shopgirl I once was. That night, as I discovered divorce papers in his briefcase, I realized he planned to leave me with nothing after taking everything from me already. The rain washed away my tears as I fled into the night, ending up in a dimly lit pub miles from the prison I called home. I never expected that the stranger who noticed my trembling hands would become my salvation. He offered me shelter without demands, something I'd forgotten existed in a world of pain. When he helped me secure a job at his investment firm, I discovered parts of myself long buried under fear and shame. My eye for design, my organizational talents, my ability to create beauty instead of just surviving ugliness. But just as I began to flourish, my husband tracked me down, threatening to destroy everything I was building. I faced a choice: run again or stand my ground. With newfound strength and unexpected allies, I chose to fight for the life I deserved. What followed was a battle for freedom that would transform me from victim to survivor, to someone who helps others escape their own nightmares. This is the story of how I found true love and success in the arms of a stranger, but more importantly, how I found myself. Buckle up, get ready, and subscribe for a special surprise tomorrow. Emma's fingers trembled as she carefully arranged the roast on the serving platter, garnishing it with sprigs of rosemary just as her husband liked. The kitchen clock ticked loudly, each second amplifying her anxiety. James would be home in exactly 7 minutes, and everything needed to be perfect. She smoothed her hair and straightened her blouse, mentally reviewing the evening she had planned. Dinner ready, his favorite scotch poured, the house immaculate. Perhaps tonight would be different. Perhaps tonight he would smile at her the way he used to when she was just a shop girl in Yorkshire, and he was the handsome businessman who promised her the world. The front door slammed, and Emma's heart lurched. Heavy footsteps, uneven and aggressive, told her everything she needed to know before she even saw his face. What's this then? James appeared in the doorway, his tie loosened, eyes bloodshot. He gestured dismissively at the carefully set table. "I made your favorite," Emma said, her voice soft, placating. "Roast beef with—" "It's overcooked," he interrupted, poking at the meat she'd spent hours preparing. "Dry as dust, just like you." He laughed at his own cruelty, the sound devoid of humor. Emma's gaze dropped to the floor, a practiced response to avoid triggering his temper. "I can make something else if you prefer." "Don't bother." James grabbed the glass of scotch and drained it in one swallow. Useless as always. I should have known better than to marry a shop girl. The words were familiar barbs, ones she'd heard countless times over their 3-year marriage. Emma retreated to the kitchen, her shoulders hunched protectively as she began clearing away the untouched meal. Behind her, James poured himself another drink, muttering about wasted money and wasted potential. Later that night, as Emma lay awake beside her snoring husband, she found herself thinking about the early days. How charming James had been when he'd walked into the small shop where she worked in Yorkshire. How his smile had lit up his face as he asked her to dinner. How gentle his hands had been. The first slap had come 6 months into their marriage, a small disagreement about money that escalated when Emma suggested they could cut back on his expensive suits. The apologies afterward had been profuse, accompanied by flowers and promises it would never happen again. But it did happen again, and again, until the apologies stopped altogether, replaced by accusations that she had driven him to it, that she was lucky he kept her at all. Morning came too quickly. Emma rose before James, preparing his breakfast and ironing his shirt with practiced efficiency. Their routine was a carefully choreographed dance designed to avoid conflict, a dance Emma had perfected out of necessity and fear. "My mother called," James announced as he buttoned his cuffs. "She's coming for dinner Friday." Emma nodded, her stomach tightening. Her mother-in-law was a sharp-eyed woman who had once declared Emma perfect for her son, a compliment that now felt like a curse. "I'll prepare something special," Emma promised, already planning a menu that would meet with the older woman's approval. "See that you do, and for God's sake, do something with your hair. You look like you've been dragged through a hedge." The casual cruelty stung, but Emma merely nodded again. She caught a glimpse of herself in the hallway mirror as James left for work. Tangled blonde hair, pale green eyes shadowed with exhaustion, cheeks devoid of color. When had she become this hollow-eyed stranger? The day passed in a blur of housework and errands, each task performed with the singular goal of making the evening as smooth as possible. Emma stopped at the market, selecting vegetables for dinner with care, using the housekeeping money James allocated with precision. As she waited in the checkout line, her gaze fell on a young couple ahead of her. The man's arm draped casually around the woman's shoulders, his expression soft as she laughed at something he said. The woman leaned into him, unafraid, unguarded. Emma felt a pang of something between envy and grief. That evening, James returned home in a rage unlike any Emma had seen before. He slammed his briefcase on the counter, his face mottled with anger. "The deal fell through," he spat, pacing the kitchen like a caged animal. "Months of work wasted because of incompetent fools." Emma froze, recognizing the dangerous edge in his voice. "I'm sorry to hear that. Would you like me to pour you a drink?" The glass she offered shattered against the wall, inches from her head. "You think a drink will fix this?" James advanced on her, backing her against the counter. "What would you know about business, about real problems? You're nothing but a burden." The first blow caught Emma across the cheek, snapping her head to the side. The second sent her sprawling to the floor. Through the ringing in her ears, she heard James continuing to rant about the failed business deal, about the money they'd lost, about how everything was falling apart. When he finally stormed out of the kitchen and upstairs, Emma remained on the floor, tasting blood where her lip had split. Only when she heard the shower running did she dare to move, pulling herself up with trembling arms. She mechanically began cleaning up the broken glass, each movement careful and deliberate, despite her pain. As she reached for James's discarded briefcase to move it from the counter, the clasp sprang open, spilling papers onto the floor. Among them, Emma discovered a document that made her blood run cold. Divorce papers, already signed by James, dated for filing the following week. The terms were brutal. She would receive nothing, not even support for a transition period. After 3 years of verbal and physical abuse, he planned to discard her as easily as he'd broken the glass. Emma stared at the divorce papers, her hands shaking as reality crashed down around her. The man upstairs wasn't just planning to continue his abuse, he was preparing to leave her destitute. 3 years of her life sacrificed to his cruelty, and he would walk away unscathed while she was left with nothing. For one paralyzing moment, she considered confronting him. The thought evaporated as quickly as it formed when she heard the shower turn off. Self-preservation, a skill honed through years of navigating his volatile moods, took over instead. Moving silently, Emma grabbed her purse from the hook by the door and slipped upstairs. She avoided the creaking third step, her heart hammering against her ribs as she passed the bathroom where James was still getting ready for bed. In their bedroom, she quickly stuffed a small bag with essentials, a change of clothes, her identification, the single credit card in her name with its meager limit, and the silver locket her grandmother had given her, the only item of value James hadn't discovered and sold. The sound of the bathroom door opening sent a jolt of panic through her body. Emma slid the bag under the bed just as James entered the bedroom, his hair still damp from the shower. "Clean up that mess downstairs," he ordered, not looking at her as he climbed into bed. "And don't wake me when you come up." "Yes, James," she murmured, slipping out of the room with practiced quiet. Downstairs, Emma retrieved her bag from where she'd hidden it behind the coat rack. She took her raincoat, knowing she would need it for what came next. One last glance around the house that had never been a home. and she stepped out into the night, pulling the door closed silently behind her. Rain fell in heavy sheets, quickly soaking through her thin coat. The cold droplets mingled with tears on her cheeks as Emma walked quickly away from the house, no destination in mind except away. The nearest bus station was 3 miles from their isolated home, a distance James had appreciated for the privacy it afforded his abuse. Lightning flashed, illuminating the narrow country road stretching ahead. Emma quickened her pace, wincing at the pain in her ribs where James had kicked her during his rage. Each step was both agony and liberation, carrying her further from danger and toward an uncertain future. The bus station was deserted when she arrived, her clothes plastered to her skin and her blonde hair hanging in wet tangles. A board listed departures, and Emma scanned it frantically, looking for the next bus heading anywhere. A late-night service to Brixton would leave in 20 minutes. She bought a ticket with cash, then huddled in the darkest corner of the waiting area, jumping at every sound, terrified James might have woken and discovered her absence. The bus ride passed in a blur of fear and exhaustion. Emma pressed her forehead against the cool window, watching raindrops race across the glass, feeling disconnected from the world beyond. By the time the bus reached Brixton, the rain had subsided to a gentle drizzle, and the first hints of dawn tinged the horizon. Emma stepped off the bus into a town she'd never visited, clutching her small bag like a shield. The unfamiliarity of her surroundings brought both fear and a strange sense of freedom. No one here knew her as James's wife. No one here would look at her with pity or judgment. She walked aimlessly through quiet streets, shop windows dark and shuttered, until the cold and hunger drove her to seek shelter. A small pub at the end of a narrow lane had lights glowing in its windows despite the early hour. The sign above the door read, "The Fox and Whistle." Through the frosted glass, Emma could see a few early patrons and the warm glow of a fire. Hesitantly, she pushed open the door. Warmth enveloped her immediately, along with the smell of coffee and frying bacon. A few men in work clothes sat at the bar, while an older woman wiped down tables. The woman looked up as Emma entered, her expression shifting from welcome to concern as she took in Emma's bedraggled appearance. "You all right, love?" she called over. "We've just put the kettle on if you'd like a cuppa." Emma nodded gratefully, sliding into a booth near the back where she could watch the door. The woman brought over a steaming mug of tea and set it down with a kind smile. "Thank you," Emma whispered, wrapping her cold fingers around the mug. "How much do I owe you?" "On the house," the woman replied, her eyes lingering on the bruise forming on Emma's cheek. "You look like you've had a rough night." Emma attempted a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Just got caught in the rain." The woman nodded, not pressing further. "Kitchen's open if you're hungry. Mary does a proper full English." Left alone, Emma sipped her tea slowly, trying to formulate a plan. The meager funds in her purse wouldn't last long. She would need to find work and somewhere to stay, all while ensuring James couldn't track her down. She was so absorbed in her thoughts that she didn't notice the man watching her from the bar until he approached her table. A gentle expression on his face. Tall and broad-shouldered with kind eyes, he carried himself with quiet confidence. "Excuse me," he said, stopping at a respectful distance. "I don't mean to intrude, but I couldn't help noticing you seem to be in some trouble. I'm Michael, by the way." Emma tensed, years of conditioning making her wary of male attention. "I'm fine, thank you," she replied, eyes darting toward the exit. Michael nodded, maintaining his distance. "Of course. It's just that if you need help finding a place to stay, my sister runs a small hotel down the street. Very reasonable rates, and she's good about privacy." The unexpected kindness in his voice made something crack inside Emma. For the first time since fleeing her home, the reality of her situation hit her fully. She was alone, injured, with nowhere to go, and an abusive husband who might be searching for her at this very moment. She began, her voice breaking. "I might need that information. Thank you." Michael smiled gently, pulling a business card from his pocket and placing it on the table without coming closer. "My number's on there too if you need anything else. No strings attached, I promise." Michael's sister turned out to be a practical woman with gentle eyes who asked no questions about Emma's bruised face or lack of luggage. The small hotel room became Emma's sanctuary for the next week as she gathered her strength and considered her options. On her third day in Brixton, Michael called to check on her. His thoughtfulness caught Emma off guard. Kindness had become so foreign to her that she initially suspected ulterior motives. But when he mentioned an administrative position opening at the investment firm where he worked, her desperate need for employment overrode her caution. "I don't have much experience," Emma admitted during their conversation. "I worked as a shop girl in Yorkshire before I got married, but that was years ago." "It's entry level," Michael assured her. "Just filing, answering phones, basic computer work. The pay isn't amazing, but it would be a start." The following Monday, Emma found herself seated in the reception area of Harrington Investments, wearing a borrowed blazer from Michael's sister and clutching a hastily created resume that strategically omitted her married name. Her hands trembled slightly as she waited for the interview, her mind racing with potential questions she might not be able to answer. Mrs. Darby, the office manager, was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who studied Emma with sharp eyes. "Michael speaks highly of you," she said, skimming the sparse resume. "Says you're organized and quick to learn." Emma swallowed hard. "I am, and I'm willing to work hard." Something in her voice must have conveyed her desperation, because Mrs. Darby's expression softened slightly. "We can offer a 3-month probationary period. You'll start tomorrow, 8 a.m. sharp." Just like that, Emma had a job. It wasn't much, answering phones, filing documents, making coffee, but it was legitimate employment with a proper paycheck. For the first time in years, she had income that wasn't controlled by James. Her first paycheck allowed her to rent a tiny studio apartment near the office. The space was barely larger than a hotel room, with a kitchenette and bathroom so small she could touch both walls at once. But it was hers. Emma spent her first night there sitting on the floor, surrounded by the few basic necessities she'd purchased, overwhelmed by the simple freedom of having a space where no one could hurt her. Work provided structure to days that had previously been dictated by James's moods. Emma arrived early each morning, carefully dressed in the modest business clothes she'd gradually been able to afford, her blonde hair pulled back neatly. She approached each task with meticulous attention, terrified of making a mistake that might cost her this lifeline. The office environment presented its own challenges. Sudden loud noises, a door slamming, someone dropping a stack of files, would send her heart racing, her body instantly prepared for violence that didn't come. When male colleagues raised their voices during discussions, she found herself shrinking, making herself smaller, an automatic response honed by years of trying to avoid James's attention when he was angry. Mrs. Darby noticed. 2 weeks into Emma's employment, she called her into her office. "You're doing good work," she said without preamble. "Your filing system is more efficient than anything we've had before, but you look like you're about to bolt every time anyone approaches your desk." Emma stared at her hands. "I'm sorry. I'll try to be more approachable." "That's not what I'm saying." Mrs. Darby leaned forward. "Look, I don't know what you're running from, and I won't ask. But you're safe here. No one in this office will hurt you." The direct acknowledgement of her fear brought unexpected tears to Emma's eyes. She blinked them back quickly, embarrassed. "Thank you," she whispered. "I'm working on it." As weeks passed, Emma gradually began to form cautious connections with her colleagues. Sarah from accounting invited her to lunch. Tom from IT showed her shortcuts on the computer system. Michael checked in regularly, his presence becoming a steady comfort rather than a source of anxiety. One morning in her 3rd month at Harrington Investments, Emma found herself laughing at a joke someone made in the break room. The sound surprised her. Bright and genuine, an expression of joy she hadn't experienced in so long she'd forgotten what it felt like. The realization that she could still laugh, could still feel something beyond fear and resignation, hit her with unexpected force. That evening, as Emma walked home, she noticed details she'd been too scared to absorb before. The cheerful yellow flowers in the window boxes of a neighboring building, the delicious smell wafting from a local bakery, the friendly nod from the newsagent who recognized her from her daily commute, small moments of normalcy that had once been commonplace but now felt like precious gifts. In her apartment, Emma stood before the small mirror, really looking at herself for the first time in months. The bruises had faded. She had gained back some of the weight James's constant criticism had driven her to lose. Her green eyes, while still wary, no longer held the dull, defeated look of someone merely surviving. She was building something here, not just employment, but a life, a safe routine that belonged to her alone. The constant fear that had been her companion for so long had begun to recede, not gone, but no longer overwhelming. That night, Emma dreamed of James finding her. She woke gasping, sheets tangled around her legs, the phantom sensation of his hands on her throat. Dawn was hours away, but she didn't try to go back to sleep. Instead, she made tea and sat by her small window, watching the street below gradually come to life as the sky lightened. The nightmares were less frequent now, but still vivid. Her body remembered the abuse even as she tried to move forward. Some mornings she could almost convince herself she was healing. Other days, a raised voice or unexpected touch would catapult her back to that kitchen floor. James's rage surrounding her like a storm. On those difficult days, Emma held tight to the simple truth that had become her mantra. Today, I am safe. Today, I am free. Tomorrow, I will be stronger. 4 months into her position at Harrington Investments, Emma was called into Mrs. Darby's office. Her first instinct was fear. Perhaps she'd made a mistake. Perhaps they no longer needed her. She smoothed her skirt nervously as she entered, prepared for bad news. Instead, Mrs. Darby was smiling. "The quarterly board meeting is next week," she explained. "We need to spruce up the conference room. New CEO likes to make a good impression." Emma nodded, waiting for instructions on what papers to prepare or refreshments to order. "The budget for decorating is pitiful," Mrs. Darby continued. "I overheard you talking to Sarah about rearranging your apartment. You seem to have an eye for that sort of thing. Any chance you could work some magic with the conference room?" The request caught Emma completely off guard. "Me? I don't have any formal training in decorating." "We don't need formal. We need practical and impressive on a shoestring budget. Think you could manage it?" Emma found herself nodding before she'd fully processed the request. "I could try." That weekend found Emma in the empty office, surveying the tired conference room with critical eyes. The space wasn't terrible. Large windows provided good natural light, and the furniture was solid if outdated. But the walls were an institutional beige, the curtains faded, and the overall impression was one of neglect. Working methodically, Emma began transforming the space. She repositioned the heavy conference table to better utilize the natural light. She removed the dusty artificial plants and replaced them with simple glass vases holding fresh flowers. From a nearby secondhand shop, she purchased inexpensive artwork to break up the monotony of the walls. Her most inspired touch came when she discovered a storeroom filled with forgotten company awards and historic photographs. Emma created a display wall showcasing the firm's achievements, arranging the items in a way that told the story of Harrington Investments' growth from a small family business to a respected financial institution. By Sunday evening, the transformation was complete. Emma stood in the doorway surveying her work with a mixture of pride and anxiety. Would it be enough? Had she overstepped her role? Monday morning brought her answer. The CEO himself stopped by her desk, his expression impressed. "Mrs. Darby tells me you're responsible for the conference room," he said, his voice carrying enough that several colleagues looked up with interest. "Remarkable work. You've managed to make it look both professional and welcoming. Do you have a background in design?" Emma shook her head, a blush warming her cheeks. "No, sir, just an interest in making spaces functional and attractive." "Well, you have talent. We have a client, an old friend of mine actually, who's renovating a house he just purchased. He's been complaining about the cost of hiring a designer. Would you consider taking a look? I'd be happy to make an introduction." The opportunity seemed to materialize out of nowhere, a door opening to a possibility Emma had never considered. "I'd be honored," she heard herself say. 2 weeks later, Emma found herself standing in an empty Georgian townhouse, notepad in hand, listening to Richard Bradford describe his vision for the property. The successful businessman had purchased the house as a London base, but was at a loss for how to make it a home. "I know what I like when I see it," he explained, gesturing around the empty living room, "but I can't envision it beforehand. That's where you come in, Miss Carter." Emma had taken to using her maiden name since leaving James, one small way of reclaiming her identity. Now, hearing Mr. Bradford address her this way in the context of a professional consultation felt strangely validating. As she toured the house, ideas began flowing faster than she could write them down. The property had beautiful bones, high ceilings, original moldings, wooden floors with a rich patina of age. It needed someone who understood how to honor its history while making it comfortable for modern living. "The key is to work with the house, not against it," Emma explained as they returned to the living room. These spaces were designed to flow together in a certain way. If we respect that intention while updating the functionality, you'll have something truly special. Mr. Bradford looked impressed. "You speak about it with such passion. How long have you been designing?" The question brought Emma up short. She could lie, create a fictitious background in design, or she could be honest and potentially lose this opportunity. "This would actually be my first professional project," she admitted. "I've always loved creating beautiful spaces, but until recently, circumstances prevented me from pursuing it." She held her breath, waiting for his disappointment. Instead, he nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes fresh eyes see what experienced ones miss. The CEO speaks highly of your work at Harrington. I'm willing to take a chance if you are." They agreed on a modest fee, far less than an established designer would charge, but more money than Emma had seen at once since leaving James. Mr. Bradford wanted the project completed quickly, in time for a business gathering he planned to host in 2 months. As Emma left the townhouse, contract in hand, a strange lightness filled her chest. For years, James had systematically destroyed her confidence, convinced her she was worthless beyond her ability to serve his needs. Now, a successful businessman was entrusting her with his home base solely on her vision and ability. That evening, instead of going directly to her apartment, Emma walked to the small park nearby and sat on a bench, watching children play as the summer evening stretched long and golden around them. For the first time since her escape, she allowed herself to imagine a future beyond mere survival, a future where she might not just exist, but thrive. When Michael called to ask how the meeting had gone, Emma found herself describing the house with an enthusiasm she hadn't felt in years, the words tumbling out as she explained her ideas for each room. "You sound different," Michael observed when she finally paused for breath. "Happy." The simple observation brought tears to Emma's eyes. "I am," she realized aloud. "I think I might actually be happy." Emma threw herself into the Bradford project with single-minded focus. During the day, she maintained her administrative duties at Harrington Investments. Evenings and weekends were devoted to sourcing furniture, selecting color schemes, and coordinating with contractors. The work energized her in a way nothing had for years, giving her a sense of purpose beyond mere survival. 6 weeks into the project, with the renovation progressing smoothly, Emma joined her colleagues for a rare after-work drink. The camaraderie she'd developed with them felt like a precious gift after years of isolation. Sarah from accounting had become particularly close, often joining Emma for lunch and sharing stories of her own difficult divorce. "We should document this," Sarah insisted, pulling out her phone as the group laughed over office gossip. "First time our Emma's joined us for Friday drinks." Before Emma could protest, Sarah had snapped several photos and was tapping at her phone. "These are going straight on Instagram. The world needs to see us having actual fun outside that office." A cold wave of fear washed over Emma. "Wait, please don't post those." But it was too late. Sarah looked up from her phone with a satisfied smile. "Already done. Don't worry, you look gorgeous. Not like those terrible ID badge photos." Emma excused herself shortly after, heart pounding as she hurried back to her apartment. James wasn't active on social media. He'd always dismissed it as frivolous, but his friends were. If Sarah's post was public, if she'd tagged the company or used identifiable hashtags, there was a chance someone who knew James might see it. For days afterward, Emma jumped at every unusual sound, scrutinized every unfamiliar face on her commute. She considered telling Michael about her fears, but hesitated. Their relationship had been evolving from friendship into something deeper, though neither had put it into words yet. She didn't want her past to contaminate this new, fragile connection. The Bradford project became her refuge from anxiety. As she transformed the Georgian townhouse room by room, Emma found herself imagining what it would be like to live in such a space, safe, beautiful, entirely her own. It was a dangerous indulgence, this dreaming of futures that still felt out of reach. 3 weeks before the project's completion date, Emma arrived at the townhouse to supervise the delivery of custom draperies. The front door was unlocked, which was unusual but not alarming. The painting contractor had been scheduled to finish touch-ups that morning. "Hello," she called, setting her portfolio on the entry table. "Anyone here?" The house responded with silence. Emma moved toward the living room, admiring how the morning light played across the newly painted walls. The color she'd selected, a warm, soft gray, transformed completely throughout the day, from cool and serene in the morning to rich and intimate by evening. "It's certainly different from what I remember." The voice froze Emma mid-step. James stood in the doorway to the dining room, his familiar stance, hands in pockets, shoulders slightly hunched, sending waves of visceral fear through her body. "How did you find me?" Her voice came out as a whisper. James smiled, the expression never reaching his eyes. "Social media. Ironic, isn't it? The thing I always said was a waste of time led me right to you." He stepped further into the room, examining the space with exaggerated interest. "Playing interior decorator now, are we? How quaint." Emma's mind raced. The workers would return soon. If she could keep him talking, avoid antagonizing him until they arrived. "What do you want, James?" "What's rightfully mine?" His tone hardened. "You left without a word. Took money from our account. Made me look like a fool." "I didn't take anything that wasn't mine," Emma countered, her voice steadier than she felt. "My earnings from before we married." James moved closer, his face flushing with familiar anger. "Always an excuse. Always thinking you're cleverer than you are." His gaze swept over her, taking in her professional attire, her composed appearance. "Look at you, pretending to be something you're not. We both know what you really are. Nothing." The words were designed to wound, to remind her of her place. 6 months ago, they would have cut deep, reinforcing the walls of the prison he'd built in her mind. Now, standing in a space she had created, surrounded by evidence of her own vision and ability, Emma felt something unexpected. Anger, not fear. "You don't get to decide what I am anymore," she said quietly. "You never should have." James's face contorted. "You ungrateful bitch. After everything I gave you..." "What did you give me, James? Bruises? Fear? A life where I had to measure every word, anticipate every mood?" Emma took a deliberate step backward, maintaining distance between them. "I don't owe you anything." His hand shot out, grabbing her arm with punishing force. "You're coming home with me. Now this little adventure is over. Let go of her." Michael's voice, cold and commanding, came from the doorway. Behind him stood two contractors, tools in hand, expressions grim. James's grip tightened momentarily before he released her, turning to face the newcomers with a politician's smile. "Just a misunderstanding between husband and wife. Nothing to concern yourselves with." "Ex-husband," Emma corrected, the word empowering. "And he was just leaving." James's eyes narrowed, calculating the odds against 3 men. With a final venomous glance at Emma, he straightened his jacket. "This isn't over." "Actually, it is," Michael replied evenly. "The police have been called. They'll be interested in discussing the restraining order Emma filed last month." It was a bluff. Emma had been too afraid to file official papers, but James couldn't know that. He retreated, jaw tight with suppressed rage, brushing past Michael with deliberate force. Only when the front door slammed did Emma's composure crack. She sank onto a nearby chair, body trembling with delayed shock. Michael was immediately at her side, his presence solid but undemanding. "Are you hurt?" Emma shook her head, though the truth was more complicated. The physical pain of James's grip was nothing compared to the devastating realization that she wasn't truly free. As long as he could find her, as long as he believed he had a claim on her, the life she was building remained fragile. "We need to make that restraining order real," Michael said gently. "I have a friend who practices family law. She can help." Emma looked up at him, at the genuine concern in his eyes. In that moment, she made a decision. She would no longer let fear dictate her choices. "Yes," she agreed, "it's time." The restraining order provided Emma with legal protection, though the psychological security took longer to establish. For weeks after James's appearance, she found herself checking over her shoulder, scrutinizing unfamiliar cars parked on her street, jumping at unexpected knocks on her door. But life continued, and with each day that passed without incident, her confidence grew incrementally. The Bradford project reached completion, right on schedule. Mr. Bradford was so pleased with the transformation that he insisted on hosting a small gathering to showcase Emma's work before his official business event. The evening brought together a carefully curated group of his associates, all potential clients for Emma's newly formalized design services. "You've created something exceptional here," Mr. Bradford told her as guests milled about the elegantly appointed rooms. "I've had 3 people ask for your contact information already." Emma smiled, still adjusting to receiving praise after years of criticism. She wore a simple black dress that Michael had helped her select, her blonde hair styled in soft waves that framed her face. The physical transformation from the frightened woman who had fled into the rainy night less than a year ago was striking. "Thank you for taking a chance on me," she replied sincerely. "This opportunity has meant more than you could know." As the evening progressed, Emma found herself engaged in conversations about design philosophy, color theory, and architectural preservation. Her natural eye for balance and proportion, combined with the research she'd immersed herself in during the project, allowed her to speak with genuine knowledge and passion. By the end of the night, she had collected business cards from 5 potential clients and received an invitation to join the local design association. Standing in the foyer after the last guest departed, Emma felt a surge of pride so intense it brought tears to her eyes. "Congratulations," Michael said softly, appearing beside her with 2 glasses of champagne. He had attended as her guest, a steady, supportive presence throughout the evening. "You were remarkable tonight." Emma accepted the glass, their fingers brushing in a way that sent a pleasant warmth through her. "I couldn't have done this without you." "That's not true," Michael countered, his eyes serious. "You did this, Emma. All I did was introduce you to the opportunity, the talent, the vision, the determination. That's all you." His faith in her abilities touched something deep within Emma, a place that had been wounded by James's constant belittlement. She looked at Michael, really looked at him, taking in the kindness in his eyes, the gentle curve of his smile, the way he stood close enough to offer support but never crowded her space. "Would you like to have dinner with me tomorrow?" she asked suddenly. "Not as friends, as a date." Michael's smile broadened. "I've been hoping you'd ask." Their first date was simple. Dinner at a small Italian restaurant near Emma's apartment. Unlike her early interactions with James, where she had been dazzled by expensive venues and grand gestures, this evening was notable for its ease. Conversation flowed naturally between them, punctuated by comfortable silences that required no filling. When Michael walked her to her door afterward, Emma felt none of the pressure or expectation that had often accompanied such moments in her previous relationship. Instead, there was only a gentle anticipation as he leaned down to kiss her, his lips meeting hers with a tenderness that made her heart ache. "Good night, Emma," he whispered, stepping back respectfully. "Good night," she replied, the words feeling inadequate for the emotions swirling within her. In the weeks that followed, Emma's personal and professional lives blossomed in tandem. Two of Mr. Bradford's associates hired her for design projects, providing her with enough income to reduce her hours at Harrington Investments and focus more on building her design business. Mrs. Darby arranged for her to have a flexible schedule, recognizing that Emma's rising profile as a designer brought positive attention to the firm. Her relationship with Michael progressed with the same careful consideration he brought to everything. He never pushed for more than she was ready to give, never made her feel rushed or pressured. They spent weekends exploring London's architecture and museums, evenings cooking together in her small apartment, mornings sharing coffee and quiet conversation. Physical intimacy developed gradually between them. The first time Michael reached for her in a way that echoed James's controlling gestures, Emma had instinctively flinched away. Her body remembering trauma, her mind was trying to heal. Instead of being offended or angry, Michael had simply asked what she needed, what felt safe. That night, lying beside him in the darkness, Emma had spoken aloud for the first time about some of the abuse she had endured. Michael listened without interruption, his hand holding hers gently, his silence offering space for her truth without judgment. "I'm not broken," she concluded, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "But I'm still healing." "We have time," Michael assured her. "All the time you need." As spring turned to summer, Emma's appearance began to reflect her internal healing. The shadows beneath her eyes faded. Her posture straightened, no longer curved inward protectively. She gained healthy weight, her cheeks filling out, her skin glowing. She began to experiment with brighter colors in her wardrobe, small acts of self-expression that would have drawn James's criticism. One warm July evening, as they walked along the river after dinner, Michael turned to her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "I love you," he said simply. "I don't expect you to say it back. I just wanted you to know." Emma stopped walking, the Thames flowing steadily beside them, London's lights reflecting on its surface. A year ago, those words would have terrified her, would have felt like chains rather than freedom. Now, looking at Michael's face, open, honest, expecting nothing in return, she recognized the vast difference between possession and love. "I love you too," she replied, the words feeling like stepping into sunlight after a long darkness, "and that scares me less than I thought it would." The peace Emma had so carefully constructed shattered on an ordinary Tuesday morning. She was at her desk at Harrington Investments, reviewing emails before heading to a client meeting, when the receptionist called up with a strained voice. "There's someone here insisting on seeing you, says he's your husband." Emma's blood turned to ice. Despite the restraining order, despite months without contact, James had found her workplace. Her hands shook as she dialed Michael's extension, but his line went straight to voicemail. He was in Frankfurt for a business trip thousands of miles away when she needed him most. "Tell him I'm not available," Emma instructed the receptionist, her mind racing through options. "And call security, please." Before the receptionist could respond, Emma heard James's voice in the background, growing louder as he apparently pushed his way past the front desk. Panic surged through her veins, but she fought it down. This was her workplace, surrounded by colleagues. She was not alone and helpless as she had been in their home. She stood, smoothing her skirt with trembling hands, determined to face him with whatever dignity she could muster. As James burst through the office door, several colleagues looked up in surprise. His appearance had deteriorated since she'd last seen him. His normally immaculate suit was wrinkled, his face flushed with anger or alcohol, possibly both. "There you are," he spat, advancing toward her desk. "Playing career woman while you've left me to deal with the mess you made." Emma stepped back, maintaining distance between them. "You need to leave, James. There's a restraining order." "A piece of paper," he sneered, slapping her desk hard enough that a cup of pens toppled over. "That's all you think it takes to erase 3 years of marriage? To steal what's mine?" 2 security guards appeared in the doorway, quickly assessing the situation. "Sir, you need to come with us," one stated firmly. James ignored them, his focus entirely on Emma. "You think you're so clever, don't you? Building this new life pretending to be something you're not?" His voice dropped to a venomous whisper. "We both know what you really are. Worthless. Nothing. You'll fail at this just like you failed at being a wife." The familiar words hit their target with practiced precision, reopening wounds Emma had thought were healing. For one horrible moment, she felt herself shrinking, becoming again the frightened woman who believed these cruel assessments. Then, from across the office, Sarah's voice rang out clear and confident. "That's enough. Emma is one of the most talented, hard-working people in this office. The only failure here is you." The unexpected defense broke the spell of James's words. Other colleagues murmured in agreement, several standing as if to physically support Emma if needed. The security guards moved forward, flanking James. "Sir, this is your final warning. Leave willingly or we'll escort you out and call the police." James looked around, seemingly surprised to find himself surrounded by people ready to defend Emma. His face contorted with rage, but self-preservation won out. With a final glare at Emma, he allowed himself to be escorted from the office. In the silence that followed, Emma found her legs wouldn't support her. She sank into her chair, adrenaline draining away to leave her shaking and nauseous. Sarah was immediately at her side, a protective arm around her shoulders. "Are you all right? Should we call someone?" Emma shook her head, unable to form words past the tightness in her throat. The humiliation of having her colleagues witness this confrontation, of having her past exposed so publicly, overwhelmed her. After months of building a new identity, of being valued for her skills and intelligence, James had reduced her again to the role of victim in front of everyone who respected her. Mrs. Darby appeared, her normally stern face softened with concern. "Emma, take the rest of the day. We'll reschedule your meetings." "I can't," Emma protested weakly. "The Westmore project presentation is today." "And it will wait until tomorrow," Mrs. Darby replied firmly. "Sarah will take you home." The journey to Emma's apartment passed in a blur. Once inside, the full impact of the morning's events hit her. She sank onto her sofa, tears finally breaking free. "He found me again," she whispered. "It's never going to end, is it?" Sarah sat beside her, offering silent support. "Have you called Michael?" Emma shook her head. "He's in Frankfurt. I don't want to worry him when there's nothing he can do from there." "You should tell him," Sarah said gently. "That's what partners do. They share burdens, even when they can't fix them." The words struck Emma forcefully. In all her years with James, she had never been able to share her true feelings without fear of his reaction. The ability to be honest about her pain, to be vulnerable without being punished for it, was still a foreign concept. "I keep thinking I should leave Brixton," Emma admitted. "Start over somewhere new, somewhere he can't find me." Sarah's expression grew serious. "Is that what you want? To run? To give up everything you've built here because of him?" The question hung in the air between them. Emma thought about her growing design business, her colleagues who had defended her, Michael who loved her without trying to control her. She thought about the woman she was becoming, stronger, more confident, capable of creating beauty from wreckage. "No," she said finally, the word carrying more certainty than she felt. "No, I don't want to run, but I don't know how to stop being afraid either." Sarah squeezed her hand. "By doing exactly what you've been doing, building a life so full and strong that his presence becomes smaller every day. He showed up today hoping to destroy what you've created, to drag you back to where he could control you. Don't let him win by leaving." Emma nodded slowly, recognizing the truth in Sarah's words. James's appearance had shaken her deeply, but running would mean surrendering everything she had fought so hard to achieve. That evening, when she finally called Michael, the sound of his voice brought fresh tears to her eyes. She told him everything: James's appearance, her colleagues' support, her momentary consideration of fleeing. "I'll come back tonight," Michael offered immediately. "I can be on the next flight." "No," Emma replied, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "Finish your work. I'm okay, really. Sarah's staying over tonight, and I've reported the violation of the restraining order to the police. He won't try anything else so soon." "Are you sure?" Emma looked around her small apartment at the life she had built from nothing. "I'm sure. This is my home now. I won't let him take that from me." By the time Michael returned from Frankfurt, Emma had largely regained her composure. The police had taken her report seriously, documenting James's violation of the restraining order and promising increased patrols in the area. Her colleagues had been unexpectedly supportive, treating her with respect rather than pity after witnessing James's behavior. Still, the confrontation had left its mark. Emma found herself checking her surroundings constantly, startling at unexpected sounds, sleeping fitfully despite Michael's reassuring presence beside her. The hard-won peace of recent months felt tenuous, threatened by James's persistent belief that he still had a claim on her. 2 weeks after the incident, Emma received an official-looking envelope at her office. Inside was a court summons. James was suing her, claiming she had stolen money from their joint account before leaving him. The amount he cited was vastly inflated, including funds Emma had earned before their marriage that she had taken when she fled. "This is ridiculous," Michael said when she showed him the papers that evening. "He has no case. You took your own earnings." Emma sat heavily on the sofa, the familiar weight of anxiety settling on her chest. "It doesn't matter if he wins or loses. The point is to drag me into court, to force me to face him, to disrupt my life." She looked up at Michael, her expression bleak. "He's punishing me for leaving." Michael sat beside her, his face serious. "Then we fight back. Not just defensively, but offensively." "What do you mean?" "I have a friend who specializes in financial forensics. Let him look at your bank records, the history of your accounts with James. If James is cooking the books to make this claim, we might find evidence of other financial misdeeds." The suggestion gave Emma pause. Throughout their marriage, James had always handled their finances, becoming angry whenever she asked questions. His business dealings had often seemed questionable, with cash flowing in and out of their accounts in patterns that made little sense to her. "You think he's been doing something illegal?" Michael shrugged. "I don't know, but men who abuse their wives often engage in other forms of misconduct. It's worth investigating." The decision to actively investigate James, rather than simply defend against his accusations, marked a turning point for Emma. No longer merely reacting to his attacks, she was taking control, gathering ammunition to protect herself. Michael's friend, a forensic accountant named David, met them at Michael's apartment the following weekend. As they spread financial records across the dining table, David's expression grew increasingly troubled. "These transactions don't add up," he explained, pointing to a series of large deposits and withdrawals. "He's moving money through shell companies, probably to avoid taxes, but there's something else here, too." He made some notes, brow furrowed in concentration. "Some of these patterns are consistent with money laundering." Emma felt a chill run through her. Are you sure? Not definitively without more information, but it warrants investigation. David looked up from the papers. Did he ever discuss his business dealings with you? Emma shook her head. He kept me completely in the dark, said I wouldn't understand that it was men's business. Classic isolation tactic, David muttered. Keep the spouse ignorant so they can't be a witness later. In the weeks leading up to the court date, Emma worked with Michael and David to compile a comprehensive financial history. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became that James had been engaged in questionable financial practices for years, potentially involving tax evasion and fraud. Emma's lawyer, a formidable woman named Rebecca, who Michael had introduced her to months earlier, was confident. He picked the wrong battle, she assured Emma during their final preparation meeting. By coming after you financially, he's opened the door to scrutiny he can't afford. The day of the hearing dawned bright and clear, a sharp contrast to the churning anxiety in Emma's stomach. Michael drove her to the courthouse, his steady presence a balm to her frayed nerves. "Remember," he said as they approached the imposing building, "you've done nothing wrong. He's the one who should be afraid today." The courtroom was smaller than Emma had imagined, the atmosphere tense and formal. James sat on the opposite side with his lawyer, a slick-looking man in an expensive suit. When James caught sight of Emma, he smirked, clearly expecting her to be intimidated by the proceedings. Instead, Emma met his gaze steadily, refusing to shrink under his scrutiny. The months of building a new life, of reconnecting with her own strength, had prepared her for this moment. She was no longer the frightened woman who had fled into the rain. She was Emma Carter, interior designer, valued colleague, beloved partner, a woman with purpose and dignity. As the hearing began, James's lawyer presented his case first, painting Emma as a deceitful wife who had stolen funds and abandoned her marital responsibilities. The characterization was so at odds with reality that Emma found herself almost dissociating, as if they were discussing a stranger. When Rebecca rose to present Emma's defense, her approach was methodical and devastating. She systematically dismantled James's claims, presenting bank records showing the modest sum Emma had taken consisted entirely of her premarital earnings. Then she went on the offensive. "Your Honor, in preparing our defense, we've uncovered evidence of financial irregularities that go far beyond this dispute." Rebecca presented the documents David had helped prepare, highlighting patterns of suspicious transactions. "We believe Mr. Harrison has initiated these proceedings not to recover legitimately lost funds, but to intimidate my client, who may be a potential witness to financial crimes." James's face drained of color. His lawyer immediately objected, claiming the allegations were irrelevant to the current proceedings, but the damage was done. The judge, a stern woman with penetrating eyes, studied the documents with evident interest. "These allegations are concerning," she noted, looking directly at James. "While they may not be directly relevant to the matter at hand, I cannot ignore potential evidence of criminal activity." She turned to James's lawyer. "Counsel, I strongly suggest you confer with your client." A hasty, whispered conference followed, during which James's expressions cycled through shock, anger, and finally calculation. When his lawyer addressed the court again, his tone had completely changed. "Your Honor, in the interest of resolving this matter expeditiously, my client wishes to withdraw his claim against Ms. Carter." The judge nodded, making a note in her file. "Very well. The claim is dismissed." She looked directly at Emma. "Ms. Carter, you are free to go. Mr. Harrison, I suggest you remain available. These financial records will be reviewed by the appropriate authorities." As they left the courtroom, Emma felt a wave of emotions too complex to name. Relief, vindication, a strange sense of closure. James had tried to use the legal system to continue controlling her, but instead had exposed himself to scrutiny that could have serious consequences. "It's over," Michael said quietly as they walked toward the exit. "Really over this time." Emma nodded, the truth of it settling into her bones. Yes, I think it finally is. Emma stood at the back of the ballroom surveying her handiwork with quiet satisfaction. 2 years had passed since the courthouse confrontation with James. 2 years of building a life so different from anything she could have imagined during those dark days of her marriage that it sometimes felt like a dream. The formal investigation into James's financial activities had revealed extensive fraud. He was currently serving a 3-year sentence, his carefully constructed facade of respectability shattered. The news had brought Emma no joy, only a sense of closure and the knowledge that he could no longer hurt her or anyone else for the foreseeable future. Her design business had flourished beyond her most optimistic projections. What had begun with the Bradford project had evolved into Emma Carter Designs, a boutique firm specializing in renovating historic properties while honoring their architectural integrity. She had hired 2 junior designers and an office manager, freeing her to focus on the creative aspects she loved most. The ballroom she now stood in represented her most ambitious project to date, the complete restoration of a Victorian hotel that had fallen into disrepair. The owners had given her creative control and a generous budget, trusting her vision after seeing her portfolio of successful transformations. "It's magnificent," Michael said, appearing beside her with 2 champagne glasses. "They're going to be thrilled." Emma accepted the glass, her engagement ring catching the light from the crystal chandeliers she had painstakingly restored. Michael had proposed 6 months earlier during a weekend trip to Yorkshire, where Emma had finally felt ready to revisit her roots. The ring had been his grandmother's, reset with a new stone that caught green and blue lights, reminiscent of Emma's eyes. "I hope so," she replied, though her confidence in the project was evident in her relaxed posture and clear gaze. The lighting installation was worth every penny of that budget battle. Michael smiled, slipping his arm around her waist, always the perfectionist. The observation held no criticism, only affection. Michael had supported every step of her professional evolution, celebrating her successes and providing steady encouragement through challenges. Their relationship had deepened into a partnership built on mutual respect and genuine appreciation of each other's strengths. As they stood together, Emma's thoughts drifted to the settlement money from James's financial crimes. After legal fees, she had received a substantial sum, compensation for assets he had hidden during their marriage, and funds she was entitled to as his spouse. The amount had sat untouched in her account for months while she deliberated how to use it. The idea had come during a conversation with Sarah, who now worked as Emma's office manager. Sarah had mentioned a former colleague who volunteered at a women's shelter, describing the drab, institutional spaces where women and children sought refuge from domestic violence. "They deserve better," Emma had said immediately. "They deserve beauty and dignity, especially after what they've been through." From that moment, the Emma Carter Foundation had taken shape in her mind, a nonprofit dedicated to redesigning shelters and transitional housing for survivors of domestic abuse. She would use her settlement money as seed funding and donate a percentage of her design firm's profits to sustain the work. The foundation's first project was nearly complete, a comprehensive renovation of Brixton's largest women's shelter. Emma had approached it with the same attention to detail she brought to her high-end residential projects, creating spaces that were not only functional, but uplifting and restorative. "Penny for your thoughts," Michael said, drawing her back to the present. Emma smiled, leaning slightly into his solid presence. "I was thinking about the shelter. The opening ceremony is next week." "Nervous?" "A little," she admitted. "It's more personal than my commercial work. I want to get it right for them." Michael's expression softened with understanding. "You have. I've seen it, remember? You've created something extraordinary." The validation warmed her. In the early days after escaping James, Emma had craved reassurance, needing external confirmation of her worth after years of systematic degradation. Now, while she appreciated Michael's support, her confidence came primarily from within. from knowing her own capabilities and the impact of her work. "We should head back," she said, finishing her champagne. "The caterers will be arriving soon for the preview dinner." As they walked towards the exit, Emma's phone chimed with a message. She glanced at the screen to see a text from her mother, confirming her travel plans for the shelter opening. The reconnection with her family had been another healing milestone of the past year. After initial awkwardness and the painful process of explaining why she had stayed silent about James's abuse for so long, they had rebuilt their relationship on more honest foundations. Outside the hotel, the spring evening was mild, cherry blossoms drifting on a gentle breeze. Emma paused on the steps, breathing in the sweet scent, allowing herself a moment to appreciate the simple joy of existing without fear. "Sometimes I still can't believe this is my life," she said softly, "that I made it here." Michael squeezed her hand gently. "You did more than make it. You thrived." The observation was accurate. Emma had not merely survived James's abuse and escaped to safety. She had transformed her pain into purpose, building a life filled with meaningful work and genuine connections. The frightened woman who had fled into the rain was still part of her story, but no longer defined her present or her future. As they walked to their car, Emma's thoughts turned to the speech she was preparing for the shelter opening. She wanted to strike the right balance, acknowledging the reality of abuse without letting it dominate the narrative, offering hope without minimizing the struggle, sharing enough of her own journey to connect without making herself the focus. The women who would benefit from the renovated shelter deserved a space that honored their dignity and resilience. Emma understood this on a bone-deep level that no design school could have taught her. Beauty was not a luxury, but a necessity, especially for those whose sense of self had been damaged by violence and control. This understanding informed every aspect of her design philosophy now, the belief that physical environments could either wound or heal, constrain or liberate. When she looked back at the frightened, diminished woman she had been in James's house, she recognized how the very architecture of that space had reinforced her captivity, with its isolated location and rooms designed for show rather than comfort. In contrast, the spaces she created now emphasize light, connection, and personal agency, designs that encourage their inhabitants to flourish rather than merely exist. This transformation in her approach to space mirrored her personal journey from confinement to freedom, from survival to purpose. As Michael drove them home, Emma leaned back in her seat, a sense of peaceful anticipation settling over her. The life she had built wasn't perfect. She still had moments of anxiety, still woke occasionally from nightmares of James's rage, but it was authentic and meaningful in ways she had once thought permanently beyond her reach. Tomorrow would bring new clients, new designs, new opportunities to transform spaces and perhaps the lives of those who inhabited them. And for now, that was more than enough. The renovated shelter gleamed in the morning sunlight, its facade transformed from institutional drabness to welcoming elegance. Emma stood before the gathered crowd, her heart full as she prepared to speak. Behind her, the building represented everything she had learned about creating spaces that heal. Dignified yet practical, beautiful without being precious, secure without feeling confined. The audience included local officials, donors, shelter staff, and a small group of current and former residents who had agreed to participate in the opening ceremony. In the front row sat Michael, his expression radiating pride, alongside Emma's parents who had traveled from Yorkshire for the occasion. Sarah was there too, along with colleagues from Harrington Investments and clients who had become friends over the years. Most meaningful to Emma were the women watching from the edges, those who had experienced the kind of abuse she had endured and escaped. Their presence reminded her of the purpose behind this project, the reason she had established the foundation that now bore her name. 5 years ago, Emma began, her voice steady and clear, I fled my home in the middle of a rainstorm with nothing but a small bag and the desperate hope of finding safety. I had endured 3 years of abuse that had convinced me I was worthless, that I deserved the pain inflicted on me, that I would never be more than a victim. She paused, meeting the eyes of women in the audience, who nodded in silent understanding. I was fortunate. A chance encounter with a kind stranger led to shelter, then employment, then the opportunity to discover talents I never knew I possessed. Not everyone has that luck, that random act of kindness that changes the trajectory of their lives. That's why this shelter, and others like it, are so vital. Emma gestured toward the building behind her. When designing this renovation, I focused on creating a space that communicates an essential truth to everyone who walks through those doors. You have value. You deserve beauty. Your safety matters. Your healing matters. She described the thoughtful elements incorporated into the design: private spaces that respected individual dignity, communal areas that fostered connection without forcing it, playrooms where children could process trauma through creativity, counseling rooms designed to feel safe rather than clinical. This building is more than a shelter. It's a statement about who we believe these women and children are, not burdens to be warehoused, not problems to be solved, but whole human beings worthy of environments that nurture their recovery and support their rebirth. As Emma concluded her remarks and officially opened the facility, the audience rose in applause. The ceremonial ribbon was cut, and people began filtering inside to tour the renovation. Emma found herself surrounded by well-wishers and congratulations, accepting each with genuine gratitude while carefully making her way toward the one person she most wanted to speak with. Angela stood near the entrance, visibly hesitant about joining the tour. In her early 30s, with dark circles under her eyes and clothing that hung loosely on her thin frame, she reminded Emma powerfully of herself in those first desperate days after escape. "Would you like me to show you around?" Emma offered quietly, approaching with the careful respect for personal space she wished someone had shown her when she was at her most fragile. Angela nodded, clutching her purse tightly. "Your speech," she said, her voice barely audible above the ambient conversation. "You understand?" "I do," Emma confirmed simply. As they moved through the building, Emma pointed out features designed with survivors in mind: secure entry systems, abundant natural light, calming color palettes, flexible spaces that residents could personalize. Angela said little, but her gaze absorbed everything, lingering on details that might seem insignificant to others, but represented profound thoughtfulness to those who had lived with abuse. In the communal kitchen, designed to encourage shared meals while respecting individual needs, Angela finally spoke more than a few words. "My husband would throw plates when dinner wasn't what he wanted," she said, running her fingers along the sturdy countertop. "The children would hide under the table. I stopped cooking anything with strong smells because it might trigger him." Emma nodded, remembering her own careful meal preparations, the constant anxiety about James's reactions. "Here, you can cook what you want," she said simply. "The children can help if they want to. There's no wrong way to use this space." Something in Angela's expression shifted, a tiny spark of possibility perhaps, or the first tentative consideration that her future might contain choices her past had denied her. "I don't know how to start over," she admitted. "I don't have your talent or education." Emma shook her head. "Neither did I when I left. I was a shop girl from Yorkshire who'd been told for years that I was nothing. Starting over isn't about having advantages. It's about taking one step, then another, and finding people who will walk beside you rather than push you down." As they continued the tour, Emma shared more of her own journey, not as inspiration, but as evidence that the darkness Angela was experiencing was not permanent, not defining, not the end of her story. By the time they reached the children's area, Angela's posture had subtly changed, her shoulders less hunched, her gaze more direct. "My daughter loves art," she said, looking at the well-stocked supply cabinets. "She hasn't had materials to work with since we left." She can use anything here, Emma assured her. This space belongs to her too. Later, as the formal event wound down and guests began to depart, Michael found Emma sitting quietly in the shelter's garden, a thoughtfully designed space with winding paths and secluded benches where residents could find moments of peace. "There you are," he said, sitting beside her. "Your parents are looking for you. They want to take us to dinner to celebrate." Emma nodded, though she made no move to rise. "I'll join you in a minute. I just needed a moment." Michael studied her face. "Are you all right?" "More than all right," Emma replied, her voice soft but steady. "I was just thinking about that night in the rain, how desperate and alone I felt, how impossible this would have seemed if someone had told me then that one day I'd be here, doing this." Michael covered her hand with his own. "You've come so far." Emma turned to look at him, at the man whose simple act of kindness in a pub had been the first stone in the path that led to her current life. "We all have our before and after moments," she said thoughtfully. "That rainstorm, meeting you, finding work, discovering design, each was a turning point. But the real change wasn't circumstantial. It was internal." She looked back at the shelter, at the warm lights beginning to glow in the windows as evening approached. Beyond the building, the city stretched out, full of other women still trapped in situations like the one she had escaped. Others who had found freedom but were struggling to rebuild. Others who had healed and were now helping others along the path. "Shall we join your parents?" Michael asked after a comfortable silence. Emma nodded, rising from the bench. As they walked toward the exit, a staff member approached with Angela and a small girl with solemn eyes and a tight grip on her mother's hand. "Miss Carter," the staff member said, "Angela and Lily will be staying with us starting tonight. They wanted to thank you before you left." Emma knelt to the child's eye level, maintaining a respectful distance. "Hello, Lily. I hear you're an artist." The girl nodded shyly, half hiding behind her mother. "The art room is my favorite place, too," Emma told her. "Maybe someday you can show me what you create there." As she straightened, Emma met Angela's gaze, recognizing in it both fear and determination, the complex emotions of a woman at the beginning of a difficult journey. "You're not alone," Emma said simply. "Not anymore." The words were for Angela, but they resonated within Emma as well, a reminder of how far she had come from that terrified woman fleeing into the unknown. She had not only survived, but thrived, transforming her pain into purpose and her scars into strength. As she and Michael left the shelter hand in hand, the evening sky deepening to indigo above them, Emma felt the fullness of her life with a clarity that brought tears to her eyes. Not tears of grief or fear, but of profound gratitude for the journey that had brought her to this moment and for all the moments yet to come.